hello, we're joined by Foluke Adebisi, and she's here to talk to us about decolonial approaches in teaching. So I'll start first by asking you, Foluke, if you could just tell us a bit about what decolonization means for you, please.
Thank you, Julian. I think for me, decolonization, or how I define decolonization, it's really about how I found out about it or how I entered into it in an intellectual way. So I started from trying to contextualize and theorize the mechanics responsible for incomplete decolonization in African states of African legal systems, as well as political systems, economic and educational institutions. So if you think about it in that way, my understanding of decolonization starts outside of the global north and outside of the academy, if you think in that sense. So my starting point for decolonization means that we need to define it outside of the global north, and so beyond its co-optation by the global north for purposes that ignore a particularly long history of decolonization. That's political action and scholarship by peoples in the global south, people who are racialized below the line of the human, formerly colonized people, and indigenous peoples who live in the global south. So according to these groups of people, the inauguration of colonial logics or colonial praxis or modalities of living, often dated to 1492. There's some, dispute about when this is dated to. That inauguration triggered a response to overturn those logics and modalities of living. So this reaction is an initiation of intellectual, emotional and physical labor to overturn the colonial logics and modalities of life. In other words, that's what we call decolonization. So it's introduced as an immediate response. So we date that to 1492 or, depending on who you're reading, 1444. So decolonization starts at that point and continues till now. So in essence, decolonization is a stubborn, continuous refusal of the colonial capital patriarchal conditions of domination, dispossession, and dehumanization, as well as the evolving epistemology. So that's how it makes sense within academia in our teaching. So the evolving epistemologies that keep that system in place. And so that's why for me it's quite difficult for me to use the phrase decolonizing the curriculum. That is thinking that we can, through the curriculum, overturn all global and local logics of domination and dispossession that exist within and outside the university. However, I think we can translate and apply the logics of decolonization to our work within academia. So for me, defining decolonization within my teaching is about finding ways of redesigning our work with the hope that it redesigns the world. And that's how I would define decolonization.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. That was really detailed. And what we'll do later in this discussion is look at some examples of what that actually looks like in practice. But just before we do that, are you able just to tell us a little bit briefly about your teaching context, please?
So at present, I'm a senior lecturer in the law school, and I teach general subjects, so subjects that people would usually think of as relating to law, like contract law, business law. I also teach more critical doctrinal, theoretical areas such as rich law, poor law, health law, inequalities, and law and race.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you. And then now, could you then tell us a bit about how you have applied decolonial approaches in your teaching?
So one of the ways in which, or one example of the ways, a way in which I have used decolonization in my teaching is the creation of an optional unit. So it's a third year optional unit called Law and Race, which we created. So it was myself and Dr. Yvette Russell. So we co-designed it. And I believe that was in 2018. So one of the things that happened prior to this design was that quite a number of students had said that there were lots of absences around, for example, racial inequalities, colonial histories in our teaching. So they had written petitions. So the law school was quite at that point willing for us to design this unit, which we had wanted to design anyway. So it was the unit itself was in response to what we would call a felt need or a felt gap within the curriculum. But because this, request itself or almost demand was coming from our students, and this was quite a repeated request, we started out by having sort of a focus group or quite informal focus group with quite a number of the students who had made vocal representations about the absences on the curriculum. So we had a sort of coffee with about 12 students. And Yvette and I then made notes about, we asked them, so what do you think is missing? What would you like to see? Noting that those two things are slightly different. So what you think is missing and what you want to see are quite different things. And we made lots of notes, because I remember I had a whole sort of notepad about 20 pages of things they felt were missing and what they would like to see. So some of the things they felt were missing, it wasn't like they were absent, but they perspectives were kind of limited, and there are things they would love to have seen more of. And then we once we collected those notes together, we then had a meeting on our own, Yvette, Russell and I, and then designed from those absences and concerns a structure of, so at that point in time it was 10 lectures and 10 seminars to address based on our own areas of expertise. So my areas of expertise, as I mentioned earlier, really from African legal systems, international law, you could say international human rights, and critical legal studies, social legal studies, while Yvette Russell, also critical legal scholar, but mostly criminal law, feminist legal studies. So we have slightly different, actually very different areas of expertise. So we then devised from that sort of 10 different topics. So we started, the structure is that we start out by thinking about what race means, especially from the perspective of the where we are, because one of the things we found while trying to design this unit is that there wasn't a lot of scholarship on race and law, the relationship of race and law coming from within the UK. So we have a lot that talks about race and law from the United States, but that's not entirely relevant to the context which we of our teaching. So most of our students are home students, and when we've got international students, they may be from formerly colonized countries, so they also don't experience that context of the United States. However, from this context, we try to devise sort of readings from colonial history and how law has been implicated in that. But what we wanted to do was not to think of law as this almost neutral, objective area of study, but to actually look at how law has been influenced by the structural evolution of the very different meanings of racialization and the histories of colonization. And that sort of gave us a good starting point, and then began to break down, so what are the theories that are most important to this context, what are the legal methods. And then we had a couple of case studies. We had resistance. We keep on changing the case studies, by the way, so I may forget the very ones we started with, but we had criminal justice, law and race. We had welfare, law and race, and decolonization, law and race. So that's the structure that we started off with. It has evolved a little bit. So for example, we introduced law, race and literature. So where we don't have any legal readings that week, and they get to watch sort of spoken word poetry. They read works of fiction, and that's always really interesting. We talk about things like Afrofuturism, so they can go off and watch Black Panther if they so desire. So it is very interdisciplinary, because the whole concept of decolonization itself, as I described, it is transdisciplinary. So as an approach, it can be used in every and all disciplines, and that's sort of how we've approached it.
It's interesting. You talked about kind of changing the case studies and that and the way it's evolved. Would you say that the key to this approach is that it's a constantly fluid process that you're constantly looking to review and adapt and evolve from one from one year to the next?
Yes, I mean, I think on the one hand, because it's a new unit, we should really be trying to sort of respond to what our students, how they experience the unit. So what's their feedback during student evaluation, and how they have experienced the unit and what we think about that experience and what absences, considering of course that we started the unit because they suggested there were absences in the curriculum. We also then have to address absences in our own sort of remedy to the absence in the curriculum, but also thinking about what's happening out in the world, considering that when we started the unit, decolonization wasn't as sort of widely spoken about as it is now. And then, all sorts of things happen in the world. So, say, for example, with the killing of George Floyd, you have to respond to that. With the especially in Bristol, with the toppling of a Colston statue, you sort of have to find ways to respond to that within the unit. With the recent passing, or well, first reading of the Nationality and Borders Bill, then we respond to that. There's a to an extent, we're responding to two things. We're responding to students' experience of the unit, but we're also responding to things that are quite relevant to considering that law and race is an evolving concept in itself. We do have to constantly respond to that.
Absolutely, thank you. And what kind of feedback have you had from your students?
Well, some of the feedback is the best I've ever received. Ever. So, students would say, I had a student write to me 2 years after graduation saying, you've made me understand the world so much. And, now I use what we learned in law and race in my work, and they work in a law firm outside of the UK. Another thing that, or response or reaction, is that students then decide, change their career paths in relation to what we've done in law and race. So we've got students who went off to do a master's in geopolitics. Another one went off to do a master's in ethnography, because they feel that the preconceptions they've had about a career in law have been completely changed. Those are some of the positive responses. I mean, some of the not so positive responses is that we haven't covered everything about race, the relationship between race and law, but it's very difficult to cover every single thing within 10 weeks and sort of 10 cycles, because we have a long and thin academic year in the law school. So we teach across, so from September to the end of March. And with the pandemic, we had to actually cut off some of those topics. So we went down to 6 topics the first full year of the pandemic, but we've gone back up to 7 now. So we sometimes have to merge some of the topics, or not do a topic in a particular year.
Right, brilliant, thank you. And lastly, is there anything that you know now that you wish you'd known at the start of this process?
Well, quite a lot. I mean, how to teach it for one. I think each year, I think this is my best year teaching it. And I think there's no substitute for just going ahead and doing it. And I'm kind of happy that the students asked for it, and it wasn't something I was trying to design and make perfect before teaching it. So I think one thing I wished I knew was that you just have to jump straight in. The other thing which I wish I knew, but I don't know if that would have helped, is how much work goes into designing a unit from scratch. So, like I said, there are no textbooks. There's hardly any scholarship on the relationship between law and race in the United Kingdom. So we did have to do quite a lot of reading from other disciplines, I had an entire summer where the only thing I was doing was designing a unit. So if I had known that before designing it, maybe because I thought, yeah, I'm gonna, spend 2 weeks and a unit will be born, because that's how I've designed, well, maybe a little bit more than 2 weeks, but other units where there's a textbook, you follow the topics that are already set in the textbook, and then you just sort of add a few things and sort of add a few questions and class exercises. But in this case, we had to do everything completely from scratch. And, because decolonization is such a broad area, and I considering that I had been studying decolonization for my entire academic career, until I had to actually design a unit based on it, I didn't know how broad it was. So if I'd known how broad it was, maybe I would have paced myself better. But I think I would still have designed the unit anyway, but it would have been good to know how much work goes into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much, Foluke, for your time. It's been really interesting. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
Just one more thing that I want to add in terms of decolonization and putting it in our teaching. I think we've really enjoyed the experience of teaching law and races. Students have been completely receptive, but it's a third year optional unit. And when we talk about decolonization in relation to sort of critical pedagogies, I think it may be, in some ways, if you're thinking about it as a way of liberalizing or democratizing teaching, because it's an optional unit, it hasn't filtered through as such the more generalist courses. So in some ways that has sort of limited us in the law school, because we feel, well, we've done a lot on decolonization, but they're only in the optional units. So how to introduce this into generalist units is still a question we haven't been able to answer.
Right. Brilliant. Thank you ever so much.